Glass House of Spirits. I first laid eyes on the greenhouse at dusk, when the setting sun set its glass panels aflame with orange and red. I'd inherited this old property from my late Uncle Quentin, a botanist with a penchant for the obscure. Though I'd never been particularly close to him, I was always entranced by the stories of his rare plant collection. So, the day after the funeral, I drove to his estate, determined to uncover what secrets he might have left behind. Upon arrival, I realized just how neglected the place had become. Rusted gates hung askew. Overgrown vines snaked across the once grand porch. In the backyard stood the greenhouse, its glass walls streaked with grime and half-choked by ivy. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a sudden temperature drop. A hush fell over the air, as though the wind itself refused to enter. Strange plants, twisted into grotesque shapes, crowded every corner. I could almost sense them leaning toward me. My gaze was drawn to the largest wall of glass. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection. I blinked, heart pounding, but it was gone. Yet something about the fleeting image made me uneasy. It looked like a face, contorted and pale. Despite my lingering dread, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed determined to explore, but as the sunlight died, I found myself questioning whether I was truly alone in there. Night pressed in around the estate as I returned to the greenhouse with a flashlight. My nerves were on edge, but the sense of mystery pulled me back. I wanted to prove to myself that the reflection had been nothing more than my imagination. I circled the greenhouse's perimeter, shining my beam along the glass panels, searching for any cracks or illusions. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no footprints besides my own in the dust, yet the door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside, flicking on the light switch near the entrance. A row of overhead lamps sputtered to life, illuminating the tangled plants in a harsh glare. They looked even more distorted in the artificial light, thorny stems and petal-like shapes that seemed less like flora and more like living, breathing creatures poised to snap at any moment. As I moved deeper, I heard the soft whisper of leaves scraping glass. It sounded strangely like someone calling my name. Heart pounding, I froze. My flashlight beam caught on a cluster of withered flowers that swayed on their own. Every fiber of my being told me to leave, but an indescribable pull kept me rooted. A single, glossy bud at my feet started to open. Its petals peeled back, revealing an almost human-like set of teeth inside. I stumbled backward, chest tight with horror. In my scramble for the exit, my flashlight's beam flitted across the glass wall, and there it was again. A face, twisted in silent anguish, vanishing the instant I blinked. I decided to explore Uncle Quentin's study, hoping to find clues about these bizarre plants. The study was cluttered with dusty books and loose papers scattered across a large mahogany desk. The old house creaked in protest around me, as if it resented my intrusion. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps echo in the hallway, but when I checked, I saw no one. Digging through the desk drawers, I found a stack of thin, leather-bound journals, their pages filled with scrawled handwriting. Uncle Quentin had documented each plant he collected from remote corners of the world. His scribbles described unnatural growth patterns, luminous sap that pulsed under moonlight, and rumors of spiritual infiltration. One journal entry in particular caught my attention. A hurried note about the glassy illusions appearing after midnight. The faint sketches of ghostly faces in the margin sent chills through my spine. The final entry ended abruptly with a scribble: "Caretakers remain." Not at peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was reading over my shoulder. My neck tingled. The shadows in the corners of the study seemed to stretch closer. Outside, the greenhouse glowed faintly, as if beckoning me. The words "caretakers remain" replayed in my mind. Was my uncle warning me about the original keepers of these twisted plants? Or was he referring to something else entirely? Compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity, I waited until midnight to return to the greenhouse. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale glow through the old estate's windows. As I approached the glass house, a gentle mist drifted across the lawn. Each step made my stomach twist tighter, but I had to know what happened here late at night. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a rush of cool air, as though something had invited me in. My flashlight flickered wildly, and in its beam, I watched the exotic plants sway despite there being no breeze. That's when I heard them. Voices, so faint that I thought my mind was playing tricks. They seemed to emanate from within the leaves themselves, pleading, warning, crying. Something about their cadence made me think they were chanting in an ancient dialect. I inched forward, heart thunderous, until I came upon a battered watering can. An inscription on its side read, "For those who nurture, we watch with unseeing eyes." The cryptic message set my nerves on edge. Then, a jarring clang echoed behind me, and I whirled around. One of the large glass panels reverberated as though struck from the other side. In the reflected glare, I saw 3 faces pressed against the glass, pale, sorrowful, and desperate. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. Before I could gather my wits, the voices stopped, leaving only suffocating silence in their wake. I retreated to the house, trembling, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Instead, I sifted through more of my uncle's journals, searching for any mention of the greenhouse ghosts. A smaller notebook tucked between thick volumes caught my eye. Inside, it contained dated entries from years ago, penned not by Uncle Quentin, but by a man named Francis Darwin, an earlier caretaker. The pages revealed a haunting narrative. Francis Darwin had been hired to tend the greenhouse after its original caretakers mysteriously disappeared. He wrote about hearing footsteps at night and seeing silhouettes drifting through the glass corridors. One passage read, "I witnessed their faces. They are trapped, bound to the plants they once nurtured, seeking release." Another note referenced feeding the blooms, though Darwin never clarified what that meant. A photograph slipped from the notebook, a faded snapshot of 2 individuals in muddy overalls, each wearing grim expressions. Their eyes seemed hollow, as if already claimed by something sinister. A chill settled in my bones, a slow realization forming. The greenhouse didn't just harbor strange plants, it imprisoned souls. And now, with each midnight passing, I could feel an invisible chain tightening around me, tugging me closer to their realm. Night fell swiftly again. I could barely keep track of time, as if the greenhouse had a gravitational pull that distorted normal life. Against my better judgment, I ventured inside once more. This time, I brought a camera to document any evidence of the apparitions I'd seen. Each footstep echoed on the damp stone floor, the greenhouse lit only by moonlight filtering through the glass walls. The plants seemed more active, their vines curling around support beams. A massive purple orchid-like specimen appeared to pulsate, exuding a sickly sweet scent. My camera lens fogged as I tried to focus, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was breathing down my neck. Then, a faint glow caught my eye. At the far end of the greenhouse, near a cluster of twisted ferns, the glass wall shimmered as though stirred by an unseen force. I raised my camera and snapped a photo. Suddenly, a swirl of luminescent spores erupted from the ferns, floating around me like fireflies. I coughed, eyes watering, feeling them cling to my skin. That was when the reflections returned, clearer than ever. Faces of men and women, mouths open in silent pleas. I heard a raspy whisper from behind me, "Help us!" My heart jolted, and the camera slipped from my hands. The swirl of spores became a vortex of anguish as the faces pressed closer, arms outstretched. Then, in a blink, everything went still. I gasped for breath, alone but for the hush of rustling leaves. Rushing back to the house, I retrieved the camera's memory card. Hands trembling, I loaded the images onto an old laptop. Most were blurred or overexposed, but a few frames showed something horrifying. Faint outlines of hands pressing against the glass, spectral shapes looming behind them. I couldn't deny the evidence any longer. Whatever haunted the greenhouse was undeniably real. Desperate for answers, I flipped through the journals once more, searching for references to the phenomenon. One scribbled paragraph described a ritual involving a plant known only as the crimson bloom. According to Uncle Quentin's notes, this bloom opened only under a blood moon, or under specific conditions of sacrifice. My heart pounded at the word sacrifice. My intuition screamed at me to stop, to leave, but an inexplicable fascination held me in place. When I ventured outside for fresh air, the moonlight illuminated a strange shape by the greenhouse door. A dark red puddle, glistening on the ground. It looked disturbingly like blood. I approached with caution, feeling my heart thump wildly. As I neared, a small, twisted vine slithered back through the door, leaving a trail of red behind. My stomach churned in revulsion. Something inside that greenhouse was bleeding or feeding, and I felt like my every step brought me 1 inch closer to becoming its next meal. Determined to learn more, I spent the next morning digging through the greenhouse's supply room. A cramped space cluttered with bags of potting mix, old gardening tools, and half-empty bottles of fertilizer. The smell was pungent, earthy, but also tinged with decay. Searching for records, I found a hidden drawer beneath a workbench. Inside lay several tattered pages detailing the composition of the soil used for the exotic plants. My uncle had apparently mixed ordinary potting soil with cryptic elements labeled as ancient ash and essence of the departed. The notes mentioned that the caretakers of these plants used to return what was once given. My mouth went dry. Was this a reference to human remains? The idea was ghastly, but I couldn't dismiss it given what I'd seen. The further I read, the more I realized. These plants thrived on something far beyond water and sunlight. Halfway through my search, I heard a faint scraping against the locked door behind me. I spun around, adrenaline surging. The handle rattled, as if someone or something was trying to force entry. Frozen, I watched as the rattling intensified. Then, without warning, it stopped. I yanked open the door, heart in my throat, only to find emptiness. No footprints, no sign of trespassers. But the whisper of leaves from the greenhouse beyond sent a clear message. It knew I was prying. Later that evening, I stood at the threshold of the greenhouse, the door half open. The memory of that rattling lock replayed in my mind, and I hovered, unsure whether to push my investigation further. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, faintly metallic like freshly spilled blood. Taking a steadying breath, I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dim. A heavy silence reigned, as if every living thing had paused to watch my intrusion. I maneuvered carefully between overgrown vines and broad, fleshy leaves. All the while, I felt eyes upon me. I kept glancing at the glass panels, bracing myself for another ghostly face. But to my surprise, the glass remained dark and empty. I was about to leave when, behind a towering column of spiky plants, I glimpsed a silhouette. My heart stopped. Slowly, I raised my flashlight to reveal the figure of a woman dressed in old-fashioned gardener's attire. Her skin was pallid, her eyes vacant, and her feet hovered an inch above the ground. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs turned to lead. Then, in one fluid motion, she beckoned me closer with a trembling hand. A faint moan slipped from her lips. "Release us." The overhead lamps flickered, plunging the greenhouse into darkness. When they blinked back on, she was gone. Only the echo of her plea lingered in the stagnant air. Shaken by the encounter, I fled to the house and locked every door and window. Sleep was impossible. Dawn found me hunched over the journals again, desperately piecing together fragments of the puzzle. My uncle's scribbles hinted at an ancient horticultural practice. The original caretakers had bound their spirits to the greenhouse through a forbidden ritual, ensuring they could forever tend their beloved plants, even in death. I needed more concrete proof. Gathering my courage, I returned to the supply room and tore open one of the soil bags labeled Special Mix. I cringed at the rancid odor. Within the coarse soil, I found tiny, pale fragments, bones crushed and broken. Revulsion surged through me. Was it human bone? In a feverish panic, I marched back into the greenhouse. Shadows lengthened among the twisted foliage, as though the plants sensed my discovery. A vine lashed out near my ankle, missing me by inches. The reflection of my own terrified face stared back at me from the glass. But behind my reflection, a row of ghostly figures loomed. They seemed more numerous now, their lips moving in silent unison. My mind swam with frantic thoughts. The caretakers were trapped, their remains feeding the plants. And if I couldn't break the cycle, I might join them. The weight of realization pressed down on me. If the greenhouse was sustained by these tormented souls, I had to find a way to free them. Frantically, I searched the journals for any hint of a reversal or a cleansing ritual. Most entries ended in despair, describing caretaker after caretaker succumbing to the greenhouse's power. But near the back of one notebook, I discovered a cryptic set of instructions. Only blood undaunted by fear can uproot the binding. Let it feed the crimson bloom under the full moon. Speak the names of the trapped, and they may be released. The full moon was just days away. I tried to ignore the part about only blood undaunted by fear. The greenhouse had demanded flesh before. Was it now demanding mine? My stomach twisted, but a tiny spark of resolve flared within me. If I didn't try, these spirits, including my uncles, might remain bound forever. As the sun began to set, I gathered what I needed. A small knife, my uncle's final journal pages, and a list of the names I'd uncovered: Francis Darwin, Agnes Moore, and others. I approached the greenhouse door, dread roaring in my ears. The glass seemed to shimmer, as though anticipating my arrival. The twisted vines rustled like an unholy choir. For the first time, I felt something besides terror, a grim determination to end this nightmare. As dusk fell, I set up a crude altar near the center of the greenhouse, a cleared space on the ground where I spread a sheet of old canvas to keep from kneeling in damp soil. Overhead lamps flickered as I placed the crimson bloom at the center. It was the same flower that appeared tooth-like, its petals now closed tight. The air grew thick, almost stifling, laden with the smell of rotting vegetation. I laid out the notebook, flipping to the passage detailing the ritual. My heart hammered as I realized what I had to do next. The instructions were vague, but mentioned a cut freely given. The greenhouse seemed to hold its breath, vines swaying in unison. Mustering courage, I pressed the blade to my palm and made a shallow cut. My warm blood trickled onto the crimson bloom. The flower shuddered, petals beginning to part. As the first drops splashed onto the soil, a low hiss emanated from the greenhouse walls. I glanced around to see transparent faces merging with the reflections. They no longer looked frantic but hopeful, as though they sensed a chance at freedom. I cleared my throat, voice trembling as I recited the names of the trapped souls. The bloom started pulsing, each petal throbbing in time with my racing heartbeat. Then, with a silent explosion, the flower unfurled, revealing a dark, gaping center. The next phase of the ritual had begun. I felt lightheaded, whether from blood loss or sheer terror, I couldn't tell. The crimson bloom center swirled like ink underwater, revealing faint, swirling shapes. My throat tightened as I recognized ghostly faces spinning within. Each soul's features were etched in sorrow, yet they seemed drawn toward the bloom's gaping center. Following the notebook's instructions, I stood, ignoring the sting in my palm, and placed my free hand against the glass. A wave of cold surged through me, as if I'd pressed my hand into a block of ice. From the corner of my eye, I saw the reflection of a caretaker drifting closer on the other side of the glass. Pale lips formed silent words. I concentrated, repeating the names I'd memorized, daring to hope. Suddenly, the reflection's hand matched mine, palm to palm. A jolt of electricity shot through my body, knocking me backward. I landed near the crimson bloom, which now emitted a low hum. Its petals quivered, each layered with a translucent sheen, as if worlds were colliding within its depths. Then, in a series of faint pops, I saw orbs of light detaching from the greenhouse walls, spiraling toward the flower. The caretaker's reflection slowly faded, but not without one final, desperate gaze in my direction. A wave of dizziness washed over me, but I forced myself upright, determined to complete the ritual. The greenhouse seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Vines quivered, leaves rustled, and the battered watering can from before clanged against a metal shelf as if disturbed by invisible hands. I turned my attention back to the swirl of lights converging toward the crimson bloom. The instructions required me to speak words of release. My voice shook, but I managed. By blood freely given, by names recalled, I break the chains that bind these souls. Be free. The words echoed, as though the greenhouse had become a cavern of infinite depth. For a moment, the orbs hesitated at the flower's threshold. My heart nearly stopped, fearing the ritual would fail. Then, something intangible, a gust of wind from nowhere, pushed them through the bloom's center. A collective gasp seemed to vibrate the glass walls. The faces still trapped in the reflections contorted, some in agony, some in relief. Then, from behind me, a sharp pain flared. A slender, thorny vine had snagged my arm. Instinctively, I yanked away, tearing my sleeve. A single droplet of my blood landed on a withered leaf. The leaf trembled, and I realized with horror, the greenhouse wanted more. Even as I freed the souls, the place hungered, reluctant to release its captives without a final feast. Staggering back, I snatched the knife from the altar. The vine's thorns tore at my skin, but I hacked at it until it recoiled. Panting, I watched it slither back into the foliage, leaving a trail of dark sap. My blood dripped onto the canvas, which quickly absorbed it like thirsty soil. The greenhouse roared to life around me. The overhead lamps flickered, plunging everything into a strobe-like nightmare. Shadows danced on the glass walls, and I caught glimpses of spectral forms struggling to break free. Faces contorted in silent cries, arms outstretched, pressing against the glass as though it was now a barrier between two worlds. The crimson bloom swelled, its petals shaking violently as more orbs of light streamed inside, each one representing a trapped soul. I clamped my hand over the fresh cut on my arm, fear coursing through me. Was I losing too much blood? Already, my vision blurred at the edges. "You will not have me," I croaked, voice cracking. Summoning my last shred of will, I took a final step toward the flower. "I set you free," I repeated, louder this time. The swirl of lights intensified, almost blinding. Then, in a surge of brilliance, they shot upward, passing through the glass ceiling and disappearing into the night sky. A sudden stillness descended, and for a heartbeat, I thought I'd succeeded. The eerie quiet that followed was as suffocating as any scream. Cautiously, I scanned the greenhouse. Most of the spectral faces had vanished from the glass, leaving behind streaks of condensation. The crimson bloom, now wilted, lay sagging on the altar. I crouched to examine it. Its once vibrant petals had turned a dull gray, crumbling at my touch. Relief washed over me, until the overhead lamps sparked and died altogether. Darkness swallowed the greenhouse. My breath caught in my throat. Then, from the far corner, a single echoing clap rang out. It reverberated like a mockery of applause. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, hand trembling. At first, I saw nothing, just the quiet sprawl of unnaturally contorted plants. But then a figure stepped forward. Tall, draped in a cloak made of leaves and thorns, its face obscured by flickering shadows. It seemed neither Holy Spirit nor flesh. A voice, resonant and hollow, filled the space. "You have freed them. But the greenhouse remains hungry," my heart thundered. The figure's eyes glowed with a sickly luminescence. "Their souls are gone, yet the bond with this place endures. Someone must stay to tend it." I staggered back, half in disbelief. Could a remnant force, older than the ghosts I'd released, still inhabit this greenhouse? Was it now demanding a new caretaker? My instincts screamed at me to flee, but the figure's presence pinned me in place, as though the air had turned solid. "I won't do it," I whispered, but the cloaked form glided closer, ignoring my refusal. This place, it intoned, was built on devotion, then twisted by greed and obsession. Balance must be restored. A cold wind, impossible in the enclosed greenhouse, whipped around us. My flashlight flickered. Through the gloom, I recognized the faint outlines of the caretaker ghosts, now free, hovering at the glass walls. They watched in silence, neither able nor willing to interfere. The figure extended a hand of tangled vines in my direction. A swirling vortex of spores glowed faintly in its palm. "You need not die," it said, voice reverberating with inhuman depth. "But you must pay the greenhouse's price. Tend the living, feed the dead." My mind reeled, trying to grasp what it all meant. Could the greenhouse be appeased without human sacrifice? Or was I destined to wither here, trapped in a cycle of eternal tending? The figure's eyes fixed on me with ancient patience. Every nerve in my body buzzed with dread and a curious sense of responsibility. This greenhouse was a gateway, a prison, and it seemed I was the only one left to keep it in check. The figure's proposal rang in my ears. I thought of the caretaker ghosts, their spirits now freed from eternal torment, and realized they'd once faced a similar choice. My palm throbbed where I'd cut it, a crimson reminder of how close I'd come to being devoured. Every fiber of me wanted to burn this cursed greenhouse to the ground. Yet, as I watched, tiny buds unfurled, newborn blossoms searching for the faintest light. A bizarre tenderness tugged at my heart. Were these plants truly evil, or were they made monstrous by the cycle forced upon them? Shaking, I looked into the figure's glowing eyes. "If I agree," I rasped, "will the haunting stop? Will no more caretakers be trapped?" A rustle passed through the plants, as if they understood the question. The figure inclined its head. "They will be safe. But if you abandon your post, the hunger will return." I struggled to speak through the lump in my throat. "So I devote my life to this place, or it consumes another. Is that it?" Silence hung between us, heavy with inevitability. My thoughts raced. I pictured the rotting bones in the soil, the sorrowful faces in the glass, the swirling lights vanishing into the night. Maybe, by accepting, I could ensure no one else suffered. With a trembling exhale, I gave the slightest nod. The figure's grim smile flickered, and the greenhouse itself seemed to sigh in response. A hush fell over the greenhouse as the figure extended its vine-laden hand toward my wounded arm. Without warning, the vines coiled around the cut, tightening. Pain flared, but I held steady, refusing to cry out. The glow in the figure's eyes intensified, and I felt a strange warmth radiate from the vines, like energy surging into my bloodstream. The plants around us rustled, their leaves shifting in what felt eerily like a bow. The figure's voice resonated inside my head, no longer needing speech. "You are now the caretaker. Tend to us and we will tend to you." In that moment, I sensed a connection to every root, every petal. I felt the greenhouse breathing, and the ground beneath me pulsed with hidden life. When the figure withdrew, I noticed the cut on my arm had closed into a thin white scar. But a wave of fatigue slammed into me, forcing me onto my knees. Looking up, I saw the figure fade into the greenhouse's shadows, as though it had never been. The plants glowed faintly, acknowledging our pact. I shuddered, realizing I was now part of this place, its new guardian, living, yet bound by a supernatural contract. The door behind me creaked, inviting me to leave, but I knew my fate had already been sealed. Weeks have passed since that night, though it feels like both an eternity and a single endless day. I tend the plants daily, pruning their twisted stems and making sure each rare bloom gets what it needs. At night, I hear whispers in the leaves, a chorus of voices now less anguished, more guiding. The greenhouse still has its ghosts, but they no longer appear as tortured reflections. Instead, they drift like shadows, watchers rather than prisoners. I am not free, far from it. My dreams are plagued by vines and blossoms with human eyes, reminding me of my duty. Yet, oddly, a sense of calm has settled in my chest. I can feel the greenhouse's lifeblood coursing through me. I know now why the previous caretakers stayed until they died. Once you're bound to this place, it becomes your responsibility, your curse, and somehow your solace. Sometimes, I stand at the glass walls and catch a reflection of my own face, hazy and distant, like a spirit waiting on the other side. I wonder if one day my features will join the caretaker ghosts. Until then, I remain the silent guardian of these twisted plants, listening to their quiet, hungry breathing in the night. And if I ever falter, if I dare to abandon my post, I know this glass house of spirits will find another, just as it found me. That knowledge, more than anything, leaves me cold with fear.